Okay, well, it looks like we just hit over 400 for the participants. There is no prize to be number 400, but we, at this point, will get ready to go. So with that, I will turn on the video here. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good noon, wherever you may be. Glad that you could join us here today. My name's John Brenan. I am the Vice President of Appraisal Issues with the Appraisal Foundation, and joining me here today is Wayne Miller, who is the 2019 Chair of the Appraisal Standards Board. Thanks for being here today, Wayne.
Well, good afternoon, John, or good morning, depending upon where you are. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thanks so much. So what we're doing today is we're going to be discussing the changes for the 2021 edition of USPAP. We are recording this webinar, and it will be available on our website and our YouTube channel so that you may refer to it later if you wish. Also, at the end of the webinar, there is a very brief survey about the webinar and about the experience, and we certainly would appreciate you just taking a minute or two to complete that. It helps us provide better and more meaningful information to you. I mentioned the Alt-H feature, or the chat feature, that is available. As I said, you can go down to the bottom of your screen and find it. It looks like we've already found a couple of people have found it and have used the chat. We would really like you to make sure you have that open so that you can ask questions and so that you can get the information that we're going to be providing. Again, the easiest way to enable that is Alt-H, and you will see the chat window come up on your screen. You will also see links to information. I see we've already provided Aida Dadayach, who is the program administrator for the Appraisal Standards Board, is helping us today. And she has already provided a link to a PDF of today's presentation and the slides. You'll be seeing that. There will be other things as the presentation goes on that you will see. So with that, let's get started. One of the things that we do have a brief agenda here to show you what we're going to be talking about. Real briefly, we're going to talk about the flexibility of USPAP. We're also going to talk about what the Standards Board, what they've done and how that came about, and then the actual revisions that will be in effect on January 1st of 2020 for USPAP. So first, let's talk about the flexibility of USPAP. We often hear people say things like, well, I'm not sure I can do that. USPAP doesn't let me do that. And so in many cases, that's just not true. In many cases, USPAP does allow appraisers to perform a variety of assignments and still comply with USPAP. And this, the link to this document that we're talking about has just been put up in that chat box. You can download it free of charge for your own use. If you don't, this is kind of a close-up of what we're talking about here. And as you can see in the third column over, they are all yeses. Are these things allowed by USPAP? And all the things, this is not a comprehensive list. This is simply a summary of some of the different assignment types that can be performed and still comply with USPAP. One of the items is a no, and that is at the very bottom, and that is contingent fee. It is the position of the Appraisal Standards Board that accepting fees that are contingent upon certain things occurring is not in the best interest of public trust. So you see that as being the one outlier here on this chart in terms of things you can't do under USPAP. So we would encourage you to look at this. There may be areas of your practice. There's a lot going on in the appraisal world today that is changing, and you'll hear you'll hear us talk about that a little bit more in the restricted appraisal reports part of this presentation. But we encourage you to look at all the tools you can possibly have in your tool bag as an appraiser. There's a lot of things that appraisers have not historically done that they may want to think about. So there's our little spiel, and again, the link for this document that we're referring to here has been put in the chat box for you to download. So let's talk about real briefly how this process occurred. We have we have a process in the last edition of USPAP. There's an exposure process. It's important and critically important to understand a couple of things. One is that all changes are done completely transparently. No changes are made to USPAP without the material being provided for public consumption and public comment. And I will say here, my shameless little plug here, please, 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 if you have not commented on an exposure draft to date, please do so. The Standards Board and the Qual Board all are very, very interested in hearing and seeing your comments. And I can tell you that each and every comment is read, considered, and deliberated by the individual board members and then the board as a collective. So your comments matter. It doesn't matter who you are, what organization you belong to, what organization you don't belong to. None of that matters. What matters is you've got some things that you think are important for the board to hear and why you think those things are important. So again, please comment. There's a small number of comments that actually make up the feedback that the boards get, and it affects everyone who is a practicing appraiser. So what you see on the screen is the timeline that got us to where we are today. The changes were adopted by the Standards Board on April 5th, and the changes to USPAP as well as the courses are currently being made. And as in prior USPAP cycles, the new USPAP and the courses will be available by the fourth quarter. And we certainly encourage you to look at that and to possibly take a course as soon as possible once they become available, so that you're aware of what the changes are in your practice before they actually become effective. So with that, let's start talking about what the changes and what the areas of change and what the actual changes were. You will see in your chat box versions of the summary of actions that will go over what these changes are. There are two versions. There's a short version, which is just a handful of pages in length, and that provides a good summary and hopefully good explanation as to what the changes are and what they mean. And then there is a detailed version of the summary of action, which is well over 100 pages. And the real primary purpose for that document is to make sure that those who are developing equivalent USPAP courses or teaching the material have a full narrative of actually seeing the changes, of actually understanding the changes and seeing how they did go into the USPAP document. And these are the main areas that of change that were considered, and we're going to be talking about these each in quite a bit more detail. So let's get started with that. And at this point, I'm going to say the first main area of change involved reporting. And Mr. Miller, can you share with our audience what that was all about?
Certainly, John. First off, I wanted to back up a step and let everyone know, or remind everyone anyway, that as noted in the preamble to USPAP and uppermost in the minds of the ASB when we're considering possible changes, is that the purpose of USPAP is to promote and maintain a high level of public trust in appraisal practice. So everything is viewed through that lens. In addition, the ASB seeks the input of stakeholders in many ways, including meetings with the Appraisal Foundation Advisory Council, which is a group of not-for-profit entities with an interest in appraisal. And this includes governmental agencies, the GSEs, appraiser membership organizations, and trade associations. And also the Industry Advisory Council, a group of for-profit entities such as lending institutions, AMC representatives, and technology companies. We also receive input from resource panels of the Board of Trustees, particularly on matters of personal property and business appraisal, and also the Association of Appraiser Regulatory Officials, or ARO, which is the state appraiser regulators. And as you noted back on slide 5, John, the board put out multiple surveys, discussion drafts, and exposure drafts seeking feedback from appraisers and other stakeholders. So in a nutshell, I'm proud to advise you and our listeners that this very public process to seek stakeholder feedback works. And I'm here to tell you that the ASB earnestly considers all the feedback that we receive. All right, so jumping in, reporting options. As you know, USPAP contains 2 reporting options: an appraisal report, that's big A, big R, and a restricted appraisal report. And first off, a bit of history. During the exposure draft process of proposed changes for 2020 and 21, the ASB proposed a model that would have reduced the specificity without diminishing the USPAP reporting requirements by going to a single reporting option. And the board received valuable feedback from stakeholders, including support for this idea, as well as 2 types of concerns, which quite frankly were at opposite ends of the spectrum. A number of stakeholders correctly pointed out that the changes that were proposed would have in fact raised the bar on the minimum content requirements for a restricted appraisal report. And appraisers who provided comments indicated that they serve clients who are perfectly happy with the restricted appraisal report, and that their clients do not want and would not pay for a higher level of reporting. So the question the board had to ask itself and contemplate was, would it serve the public trust to push these clients away from appraisals to non-appraisal valuation products? Other stakeholders felt that the single reporting requirements actually lowered the bar too much on what is currently required in an appraisal report. They warned of unintended consequences that might develop if, say, a governmental agency might only request or require a minimum content reporting format when a more robust report might be necessary for some property types or intended uses. So after considering all the feedback, the ASB adopted changes that we believe will continue to protect public trust in the appraisal profession, while not creating impediments for appraisers as they continue to adapt to significant changes in the valuation profession. Toward that end, the ASB adopted 2 significant revisions to the requirements for restricted appraisal reports in Standards 2, 8, and 10. The new requirements permit additional intended users besides the client for a restricted appraisal report, as long as the other intended users are named in the report, not merely identified by type. And the second change adopted for restricted appraisal reports is a simplification of the warning language so that it no longer includes a reference to the appraiser's work file. And I just want to mention, John, you already said, we're updating the restricted report samples for the website, but listeners need to be reminded that these changes have been adopted, but they don't become effective until January 1st of 2020. So, as we complete our coursework updates and we begin to post information on the website, folks will have to use the samples that are in effect today until the end of the year, and then they can use those samples that include perhaps additional intended users.
Great clarification, Wayne, and Aida will be posting in that chat box links to those current samples of restricted appraisal reports. People are sometimes surprised to learn that there are 2 versions, a residential and a non-residential, and sometimes people are very, very surprised to learn that those 2 reports, which are in compliance with USPAP, are only 2 pages long. Even a commercial assignment that involves a property of worth, I believe, about $34 million still on 2 pages. Again, these are things that, that we encourage you to explore. And on the next slide, we'll talk just for a minute more about the restricted reports. But Wayne, going back to the changes that you made, you know, there seemed to be a lot of support for that single minimum reporting requirement. Is that concept dead and gone?
No, the ASB intends to further examine the concept of a single set of minimum reporting standards for future editions of USPAP. Just as you note, because comments to the exposure drafts have indicated significant support for the idea.
Great, great. What else was changed regarding the reporting standards, Wayne?
Well, the ASB adopted revisions to Standards Rules 2-3 and 4-3 to address situations where an assignment requires the use of a certification that does not include all of the certification elements in those respective standards rules. So in such cases, an appraiser is required to include a supplemental certification, which includes the remaining required certification elements. And notably, I should say, the board is also clarifying that such supplemental certifications do not require a signature by the appraisers. And then lastly, the board adopted revisions to enumerate and clarify the minimum level of reporting necessary under the reporting requirements for an appraisal report in standards 2, 8, and 10.
That's great. And I think that a lot of the appraisers out there will come to appreciate, you know, there's probably many listening on this webinar that use standard or common forms such as Fannie Mae reporting forms. And there's been this conundrum of being able to modify the certification and all that. I think the flexibility now that the board has come up with, saying that you don't have to sign these new these certifications provided you meet the other requirements, will probably provide some good flexibility for appraisers. I mentioned the restricted appraisal reports, and what you see on your screen now is a reference to a webinar that we did back in time. Don't remember the exact date. I believe it was late 2017. And in your chat box, there is also a link to this webinar now. And it's basically alternatives to evaluations using restricted appraisal reports in your practice. And again, we've been talking about these sample reports that, as I mentioned, that you've already got a link to in your chat box. And as Wayne mentioned, will be updated for the 2020 edition of USPAP. If you haven't, or if you don't use restricted appraisal reports in your practice, or to a very limited degree, you really might want to take a look at this, because with this, particularly with the change that Wayne talked about by allowing additional intended users, you may find that restricted appraisal reports could be a great option for you in certain assignment types. Getting back to the changes that the board did adopt, there were some comments and standards rules and some other changes related to this. Wayne, what can you tell us about these?
Well, sure. So as it regards comments, John, first let's recall that comments are an integral part of USPAP, and they have the same weight as the component that they address. They are extensions, if you will, of the definitions, rules, or standards rules, and they provide interpretation or established context. So what's important to note is the board is not proposing or has not adopted any changes to the fundamental role of comments in USPAP. So overall, the ASB adopted several changes related to comments in the standards rules, including deleting some comments that had duplicate requirements that were clearly stated elsewhere, and incorporating other comments directly into the standards rules. The board's goal here is to increase the clarity of USPAP. It should be noted that the board retained some comments it felt were necessary for users to understand the standards rules, and throughout the exposure process, the ASB received stakeholder feedback that caused the board to reinstate some comments that had been proposed for deletion in earlier exposure drafts. Finally, the ASB added some descriptive titles to each standards rule to assist appraisers, instructors, regulators, and other users of the document in locating specific subject matter.
So great. Yet another example of where feedback from the exposure draft did result in changes what the ASB was looking at. So again, please share your comments, folks. It will really, it can really make changes in your daily practice. Wayne, you talked about incorporating some of these comments into the standards rules. Can you give an example or two?
Sure. A good example, John, is the certification standards rules, which we would know as 2-3, 4-3, 6-3, et cetera. So everyone is familiar with this standards rule, which currently contains, the required certification. It begins with I certify that, and then contains that list of required certification items. However, in the current version of USPAP, that's the 2018-19 version, there are a number of requirements, musts, if you will, that live in the very lengthy comment which follows the certification. And these comments deal with such items as the obligation of an appraiser who signs any part of the report to sign the certification. Also, the obligations of an appraiser who relies upon work done by appraisers or others who do not sign the certification, including a requirement to have a reasonable basis to believe that the individuals who are performing the work are competent, and to have no reason to doubt that the work of those individuals is credible. And then finally, when an assignment requires the use of a certification that does not include all of the required certification elements, within that lengthy comment, there was a requirement for the appraisal to include supplemental certification. And these have all been pulled out actually into other sections of the standards rule. So instead of 2-3 being a single rule, there's now 2-3A, which starts out with your expected certification itself, and then B, C, D, et cetera, include now these rules, musts, if you will, that have been, elevated from comment into the actual rule. We believe, again, that this, rather than hiding something that is a requirement or seemingly hiding it in comments and the small type, pulling it out into the bold and identifying it clearly as a requirement is very important.
So just in a nutshell, what Wayne's talking about is, now there are things that are required today that are sitting there in the comment. Those same requirements are now part of the standards rules instead of being, so it's easier to understand what your obligations are. And I think there's going to be a lot of people out there that are unfamiliar with seeing a 2-3A, a 2-3B, and all that. They think 2-3 has always just been the certification. It still is, but your obligations are a little clearer on what you need to do there. So I think that was a great change that the Standards Board made here. The next area that the board addressed was the disclosure obligations in the scope of work rule. Wayne, can you talk about that for a minute or two?
Sure. The ASB adopted changes to this, the disclosure obligations section of the scope of work rule to clarify that the amount of information disclosed regarding the scope of work must be appropriate for the intended use. And further, the board added to the existing comment in this section in a way designed to clarify that the appraiser has flexibility as to the level of detail and the manner of disclosure of the scope of work. Some appraisers may choose to have a subsection of a report that they label scope of work, wherein they summarize the elements of the scope of work employed in the development of the appraisal. And others may choose to disclose the scope of work as necessary throughout the report. And the additional comment language was included to convey that a specific labeled section is not required, and that either method or a combination thereof is acceptable from a USPAP perspective, as long as, and this is key, as long as the disclosure is made and the amount of information disclosed is appropriate for the intended use of the assignment results.
Great, great. Thank you, Wayne. Another change that was made involves the competency rule and some language that most appraisers recognize. That phrase about perfection being impossible to attain. Can you tell us a little bit more about what was done there?
Certainly. The comment which begins, perfection is impossible to attain and competence does not require perfection, currently resides in the development standards rules. So those are the odd numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. And this is somewhat of an aspirational statement, which during the exposure process, the ASB actually considered moving into the preamble. However, due to stakeholder input, again, public comments, the board adopted changes that retained the statement, but moved it into the competency rule. And that, in full, the statement now reads, perfection is impossible to attain, and competence does not require perfection. However, an appraiser must not render appraisal services in a careless or negligent manner. This rule requires an appraiser to use due diligence and due care. And John, it's actually worth noting that the comment currently that's in the 2018-19 version of USPAP only appears in the development standards, but it's been pointed out that the principle should also apply to reporting. So moving it into the competency rule reduces duplication, and it also at the same time broadens the applicability of this important comment, since the competency rule applies to both development and reporting in all disciplines. I'll also mention that in one of the later exposure drafts, the board had proposed moving a portion of another comment into the competency rule regarding an appraiser's obligation to continuously improve their skills and knowledge. However, after receiving feedback from stakeholders, this concept was in fact retained as a comment where it currently lives in standards rules 1-1, 3-1, 5-1, and 7-1. So we didn't pull that one over into the competency rule.
Great. Well, I do applaud the board for moving that perfection is impossible to attain. As you said, it currently being living only in those development standards. Someone could argue that that creates an expectation of perfection in reporting, and it certainly you certainly wouldn't want someone who makes a simple typographical error to say, well, USPAP doesn't say that you don't have to be perfect in reporting. So I think that was a great change.
Well, common sense approach.
Yes, yes, that's the word for the day, common sense, or 2 words for the day, if you will. Moving on to the next thing here, there's been quite a bit of action regarding the definitions in USPAP. Wayne, what can you tell us about there?
Well, the ASB adopted a variety of modifications and additions to definitions in order to help readers better understand USPAP. And here the effort was threefold. First, the board endeavored to define terms that differ from or are not found in popular English dictionaries. And second, in a few instances, the USPAP definitions now indicate which popular dictionary definition is meant to be used if, in fact, there are multiple dictionary definitions. And then third, where possible, the board removed comments from definitions. And similar to the effort in standards rules, in some cases, important elements that lived in the comments were pulled up into the definition proper. It's important to note that there were some terms that the board sought to define during the exposure process, but based upon feedback received, the board pulled back those definitions. And Let's see, what do we have? We have slide 12 up, don't we? Yes. So as noted here, revisions were made to the definitions of appraisal, appraisal practice, appraisal review, appraiser, assignment conditions, assignment results, client cost, exposure time, market value, personal property, real property, valuation service, value, and work file. So again, some of these are revisions for clarity. In some cases, we did endeavor to minimize comments, or we made some edits that were based upon other edits that were made in the document itself. Moving on to slide 13, we did add some terms. So newly defined terms include assignment elements, effective date, misleading, personal inspection, physical characteristics, and relevant characteristics. And again, these are terms about which, we get, and John, you man some of our feedback modes that we'll talk about actually at the end of the webinar here. But as you know, we get questions about all aspects of USPAP year-round. And so these kinds of questions about these sorts of terms do come up. What does this mean? What is the effective date? And we do have some FAQs about the topic, but it wasn't defined. What is a lot about the topic of personal inspection, relevant characteristics, etc. So we thought it best to define the terms.
Well, that's great. You're right. Having clear definitions certainly is a foundation for having understandable standards. You've mentioned a lot of not only revisions to the existing definitions, but the new ones that we just talked about. Is there any definition or definitions you want to highlight?
Well, sure. A good example is the newly defined term personal inspection. So within an appraisal certification, the appraiser has long been required to certify whether they have or they have not made a personal inspection of the property that is the subject of the appraisal report. And the board has received numerous questions regarding the nature of an inspection, what it is and what it is not. And so it became evident that a definition was in order. Initially, the board exposed a definition of inspection all by itself. However, based upon feedback received, the operative term in question, as noted in the certification standard, is personal inspection. So it's really a long-held premise that simply viewing the photographs taken by your trainee or your associate does not constitute a personal inspection. So the definition makes it clear that the appraiser must make an in-person physical observation in order to state that they personally inspected the property. And with the exception of, say, gems and jewelry, where it is common to use specialized equipment to examine the property, the appraiser's inspection commonly is limited to those things readily observable without the use of special testing or equipment. And in the spirit of public trust, again, a comment is included with this definition. We couldn't get rid of all the comments. To indicate that an inspection by an appraiser is not the equivalent of an inspection by an inspection professional, such as a structural engineer or a home inspector, or on the personal property side, maybe an art conservator. We will talk some more about inspections when we discuss some of the edits to AO2, but I wanted to highlight that one.
Excellent. And yeah, I think there are a lot of appraisers out there that have questions about inspections with some of the things we're seeing change in the marketplace, some of the new trends. There were also some other edits made. Wayne, can you briefly talk about what that was about?
Yeah, these are items that fall under the category of edits to improve clarity and enforceability. And they're really related to two terms or phrases, if you will. One is accept an assignment. And this is a phrase, sort of a legacy phrase that appraisers are familiar with. However, it has been changed in this version to agree to perform an assignment. And so without getting too technical here, an assignment is, in fact, a valuation service provided by an appraiser as a consequence of an agreement with the client. In prior versions of USPAP, the definition of assignment also had a secondary meaning, which referred to, in fact, the order itself or the contract or the engagement. And this definition was changed for 2018-19 to clear up confusion that existed over which definition applied in the various citations in USPAP. So given the current definition, remember that is a valuation service, it's not really possible to accept a valuation service. You can only complete one or perform one. Consequently, we had to change this phrase or reword this throughout USPAP to agree to perform an assignment. So the second item is intangible items. This was inconsistently referred to as, at times, intangible items or intangible assets. And we received feedback that really we should align this term, use it consistently. Intangible assets was used in standards 9 and 10, which are the business appraisal standards. And the board thus adopted changes to use the phrase intangible assets consistently throughout the document.
Great. Right. Thank you, Wayne. The ASB adopted revisions to a number of advisory opinions, as shown on slide 15 here. What changes were adopted? Let's start with the first one, Advisory Opinion 1. What changes were adopted to that?
Sure. Well, first off, John, let me say that the changes to advisory opinions that we discuss here incorporate edits for consistency with changes to USPAP that have been adopted. So, in fact, our listeners should know that several other advisory opinions, as well as a number of the FAQs, will be updated administratively for consistency with the changes that have been adopted for USPAP. We're working on that process now. We're not going to talk about every advisory opinion and every instance where an administrative edit has been made. So on Advisory Opinion 1, sales history, again, in response to some questions posed by stakeholders, the board adopted changes to provide additional detail in several illustrations related to an appraiser's obligation to analyze the sales history of the subject property. And we also made a few other changes to some of the illustrations in that advisory opinion.
I think that's great. We hear a lot of times from regulators and others, and I experienced this myself as a former regulator. Sometimes appraisers would simply report the date of sale and the sale amount and believe, mistakenly I might add, that constitutes analysis of a prior sale. So I think that's this additional guidance is very helpful. Thanks for that.
Sure.
A few moments ago, you talked about Advisory Opinion 2. What changes were made in this AO?
Well, within Advisory Opinion 2, which is entitled Inspection of the Subject Property, the board adopted edits to clarify the primary purpose of an inspection, which is to gather information about the characteristics of the property that are relevant to its value so that credible assignment results can be developed. And we also wanted to adopt some changes to reflect some changes in the marketplace related to an appraiser's inspection of a property. The guidance and illustrations further flesh out the appraiser's responsibility when perhaps relying upon an inspection completed by others, and the options an appraiser has when and if the assignment conditions are such that the appraiser cannot make a personal inspection. And finally, in response to some questions that we've received regarding the use of technology or other tools to gather information about the property, the board has added guidance regarding the nature of such alternate methods to gather data.
Well, speaking of that, about the questions with changes in technology, can you give us an example, Wayne, of how the board addressed this in this AO?
Sure. A perfect example, John, is the use of, say, unmanned aerial vehicles, or more commonly known as drones, to fly over, let's say, large acreage properties and take aerial footage. So, the board and most appraisers recognize that this could be a critical tool for an appraiser to use to gather information for this kind of assignment. However, what we wanted to point out in AO2 is, consistent with the new definition of personal inspection, the edits here make it clear that simply viewing drone footage does not constitute a personal inspection by the appraiser. Again, this is not to downplay the importance of using this tool. It's merely to say that when you get to the certification and your client expects you to advise them whether you personally inspected the property, if you only looked at drone footage, then you did not personally inspect the property.
Great, thanks, Wayne. That's I think that's good clarification in that AO. We also have listed on the screen, and one that the board addressed in the advisory opinion, is AO3, update of a prior appraisal. Can you briefly talk about what was done there?
Certainly. Over the last couple of years, actually, stakeholders pointed out that the current guidance in Advisory Opinion 3 refers to the original appraiser's firm when one is completing a report, which in particular, which incorporates prior work by reference. However, throughout USPAP, the responsibility to perform in accordance with USPAP is placed on appraisers, not on firms. Firms don't sign appraisal certifications, appraisers do. So the guidance has actually been altered to remove this firm-related obligation. It's important also to note that the board adopted edits to this advisory opinion to clarify an appraiser's obligation regarding confidentiality when they're performing an update of an appraisal using the incorporate by reference option.
Great, understood. Thank you, Wayne. Can you tell us maybe a little bit about the changes to AOs 28, 31, and 32?
Sure. In AO 28, which is a scope of work, decision, performance, and disclosure advisory opinion, the board actually adopted a replacement for illustration 2 regarding a personal property scope of work problem. And we also added a new illustration regarding a real property scope of work problem. And I certainly invite our listeners to read through those illustrations. AO31 is assignments involving more than one appraiser. I will say that the board actually only adopted a number of minor edits to this advisory opinion. A larger edit had been proposed. However, when the board decided not to adopt the definition of significant appraisal assistance, the magnitude of potential change to this advisory opinion declined. It was listed in our 4th exposure draft as a standalone section. Consequently, we included it here in our webinar. AO32 involves ad valorem property tax appraisal and mass appraisal assignments, and the board actually added an illustration, number 5, capturing information that was actually deleted from a comment to Standards Rule 5-5A And this is regarding examples of reasonable steps to be taken in mass appraisal assignments. This change was made after consultation with several mass appraisal experts and some of our sources in IAAO. The board actually concluded after that discussion that this was more advisory in nature and more like guidance, and so better placed back in Advisory Opinion 32 than living as a comment in the standards rules.
Great, thank you, Wayne. The board also adopted some changes to AO 36, which is identification and disclosure of client intended use and intended users. What can you say about that?
Sure. Well, as a result of changes that were adopted to USPAP, the ASB edited this advisory opinion to clarify the requirements surrounding proper disclosure of the client and other intended users in either an appraisal report or a restricted appraisal report, particularly in cases where the client has requested anonymity from being noted in the report. It is the client's option to be anonymous, and we had to rewrite some sections of this advisory opinion, to account for situations where we have a restricted appraisal report. The client previously was the only intended user. Now there can be other intended users, or there, come 2020, you could have additional intended users. And so we had to clarify some of that language to make this more readable and relevant.
Great. That covers the revisions that were made as shown here on slide 15 on everyone's screen. There is a new advisory opinion, Advisory Opinion 38, content of an appraisal report and restricted appraisal report. Can you tell us about this, Wayne?
Certainly. This newly adopted AO, John, actually replaces two advisory opinions, numbers 11 and 12, which are, as a result of this, being retired. Among other things, this new advisory opinion provides a side-by-side comparison chart noting the differences in the required content between an appraisal report and a restricted appraisal report. In addition, this advisory opinion provides guidance as to when it might be permissible, or when it is permissible, to convey appraisal results in a restricted appraisal report format, when it may be appropriate to issue a restricted appraisal report, how to disclose restrictions on the use of a restricted appraisal report, the implications of work file retrieval arrangements for the client or a reviewer, provides examples of the differences between state and summarized, in this case in the context of a real property appraisal report, and addresses some circumstances when an appraiser might need to exceed the minimum reporting requirements under either the appraisal report or the restricted appraisal report options. Further, the guidance clarifies, and this is important, everyone should focus on this, the guidance clarifies that regardless of the amount of information reported, so whether I'm reporting it via an appraisal report or a restricted appraisal report, the scope of work rule requires an appraiser to determine and perform the scope of work necessary to develop credible assignment results. Just because you are reporting in a restricted appraisal report format does not mean you can scrimp on, if you will, the development side of the house when coming up with your value conclusion. And then finally, this advisory opinion addresses oral reports and provides some guidance regarding the substantive matters an appraiser must cover to the extent that is both possible and appropriate when delivering an oral report.
Great, thank you, Wayne. So if we go to the next slide, we will see here that the board actually retired some AOs. Now, you briefly mentioned AO 11 and 12 a minute ago, but can you talk more about these as well?
Sure. So there are three advisory opinions that were retired. Advisory opinion 4 actually is a very narrowly focused advisory. regarding the reporting of foreclosure sales and transfers in lieu of foreclosure. We do address this topic in other places, such as frequently asked questions. And given its narrow focus, it was determined that we could retire, or we should retire this guidance. And then AOs 11 and 12, which deal with the current reporting options, have been retired since they have been replaced with Advisory Opinion 38.
Great, great. Thank you very much, Wayne.
Sure.
So that covers the material in terms of the changes for the 2020-21 edition of USPAP. You've also been provided with resources to look at the summary of actions, both the regular summary of actions and then the extra strength, if you will, more detailed versions. If you have questions for us in general, this is our contact information. One of the things that is listed here as well is this Q&A forum that we have on our website. If you go to our website, you'll be able to see it. It pops up right away. And that is a compendium of questions and answers that have occurred, questions that are submitted and answers that are provided. If you do have questions, that's a good place to check first to see if your question has been asked and answered, and if it hasn't, then you can very simply pose a new question, and we will get you a response within 24 hours. So those are some resources there for you. We do have just a couple of minutes left, so we want to try to get to a couple of the questions that have come in on the chat box during this presentation. Let's see, the first one says there is some confusion about when disclosing a property characteristic that might constitute confidential information. One concern is that most any entity can collect this information from our appraisal reports, add it to a database, but appraisers are not allowed to build a similar database. Wayne, do you have any thoughts on this issue of collecting what might be a physical characteristic, but in some ways is confidential?
Yeah, and that we get a lot of questions about that, John. As you know, confidential information is really information that you can only get from the client, or information that the client advises you is confidential. Merely viewing, the color or the size of a property or an attribute does not represent confidential information.
Great. Yes, and confidential information, as Wayne just described and as defined in USPAP, is one of the two things that appraisers can't share with anyone other than the entities the client has authorized, and the second being an appraiser's assignment results, which are the analyses, opinions, and conclusions. And in the assignment results, it's more than just the value conclusion. There are a lot of opinions and conclusions that an appraiser develops in an assignment. We have another question that says, can a client remain unnamed for an appraisal report? And in this case, they talk about an insurance appraisal, but I'm not sure that that has a special distinction. It says, and naming their insurance agents and underwriters, I assume that means as intended users. Wayne, as far as when a client wants to be anonymous, what can you say about that?
Right. Well, the client's name would have to be retained by the appraiser in the work file. So, it would be anonymous from the perspective of the appraisal report itself. You could simply state that the client's name has been retained in the appraiser's work file. The other intended users are, and whoever these other intended users are. Now, the appraiser and perhaps those other intended users and the client have to determine if this is appropriate for the assignment, but it's certainly allowable under USPAP.
Great, thank you, Wayne. And it looks like this might be our last question. There's one that says, we talked about these reporting requirements, the changes for the appraisal report and restricted appraisal report. It says, can you give some examples of the reporting requirements under the proposed changes? And Wayne, I think I actually have that chart in the new AO38.
Okay.
This is actually the first half. Is there anything you want to highlight here?
Well, I would urge actually our listeners to take a look at this chart. The board spent some time looking at these elements. We endeavored to bold items that are different, if you will, between the two types. For example, item 2 here in an appraisal report, you can state the identity of any other intended users by name or type, whereas in a restricted appraisal report, any other intended users have to be named. You can't just say, and any other bank in the syndication that is unknown to me, the appraiser, or for that matter, to the client. So these, this would be your gold standard for where to go to indicate the differences between those two reporting formats and the similarities in some cases. Great.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people have made great use of the chart that currently exists in AO11, and this is, as you point out, in the new AO38, kind of a similar chart there. So with that, I think we have run out of time. Number one, I would like to thank you, Wayne, for your participation today and providing such great information. I would also like to thank Aida Didayich for her assistance and working that chat board for us as well. And most importantly, thanks to all of you who took the time out of your busy day to learn about these changes. The last thing that you'll see there in the chat box that Aida put up is the information for the Standards Board's next public meeting, which is on October 18th in Washington, D.C. If you're unable to make it in person, you can certainly register to watch it via live stream, as our public meetings are all live streamed, and we would encourage you to do that if you can't make it. So with that, thank you all very much. This will conclude our webinar for today.
Thanks, John. Great job.
Thank you.